So it's my great pleasure to introduce Professor Anne Kandler. So she's a UP senior scientist at Max Planck Institute for Emerging Anthropology at Leipzig. Before that, after she got a PhD in applied mathematics, for some reason, she went inside into the cultural revolution world, and since then, she's been doing many fantastic works related to cultural revolution, dynamics, and even mathematical modeling. So yeah, today she's going to be talking about this how mathematical modeling can be useful to studying cultural evolution dynamics. So yeah, please welcome.
Thanks, Watara, for this incredibly kind introduction. Also, thanks to Charlie and Watara for this, fantastic summer school. So I had a really, really great time so far. So we're changing, I think level of analysis quite a bit again. So we are back to cultural evolution. And in this talk, very generally, I'm going to talk about inferring. Yes. Will you follow my voice? Does it better? No? I will talk much louder. Okay. Just raise your hand when I switch back to my lower voice. So what we want to do is we want to try to infer cultural processes from frequency data taken at the population level, or maybe more specifically, we want to ask the question whether and how we can infer processes of social learning from population level frequency data. So before we start with the more technical part, maybe let me give you a very short motivation on why this is actually an interesting question to look at. And I apologize, some of you probably heard this motivation already X times, but here we go, X plus first time. So our human species has shown a very remarkable demographic success. So we have succeeded in occupying virtually every terrestrial habitat on this planet. And by now, it is widely accepted that the behavioral adaptations that explain this demographic success are cultural. So they are transmitted among individuals by social learning and have accumulated over generations. So there's two big parts in this statement. One is social learning, and one is just simply the accumulation of cultural traits or of cultural complexity over generations. Both of them are really fascinating, areas of research, but for now, or for today, we only look into the social learning part. So social learning or cultural transmission, both terms are often used synonymously in the literature, is defined as learning through observations of or interactions with other individuals of the population or its products. So it's a very, very broad concept. And there's, of course, no single unique way on how we learn socially. And I think this scheme is taken from a review paper by Luke Randall et al. You have already seen yesterday in Alberto's talk. And all what it's supposed to show you is the sheer variety of social learning processes that have already been identified in the literature. So for instance, you can have a conformist bias, meaning a preference for high frequency variance in the population, or a prestige bias, meaning a bias for cultural variance held by the most prestigious individuals in the population, or a novelty bias, meaning you like new variants, so kind of the fashion trend idea. And given this very large variety of social learning modes that can exist in human but also in animal populations, understanding how and when social learning is used is one of the central challenges in cultural evolution. Now, of course, we are not the first one to answer this question. There's a huge amount or a huge body of absolutely amazing research trying to establish the presence of a particular learning strategy in human population. And this research has mainly centered around fieldwork approaches. So really people going out and observing, in particular children, and how they acquire knowledge. Lab-based approaches, for instance, micro-society diffusion chain experiments, inference-based approaches, and modeling-based approaches. So unfortunately, I won't have time to go into details into all those categories. So we are only going to look at the modeling-based approaches. So in here, about first attempts to develop formal models of cultural evolution along the lines of those models that stimulated the modern synthesis in biology appeared already in the 70s and the 80s. That's the groundbreaking work by two groups of researchers, Luca Cavalli-Sforza and Mark Feldman on the one side, and Rob Boyd and Peter Richardson on the other side. So they applied just simply the same bookkeeping methods developed by Fisher, Haldane, Wright, and others to culture, on the assumption that biological and cultural change are at heart post-Darwinian systems. So these early models to cultural change are actually, taken almost one-to-one from biology. And we will come to that point in a lot of detail in just a little bit. So, and on the basis of those models, those researchers tried to establish the evolutionary advantage or disadvantage of social learning over its counterpart, asocial learning, which is in this literature often synonymously with innovation in particularly unstable environments. So now, social learning, we all know, facilitates the spread of often adaptive cultural variants through the population, but of course it also bears the dangers of transmitting outdated information. So think the environment has changed. So and at that point, when the environment has changed, probably everyone in this environment that has been adapted before is not adapted anymore. So if you engage at that point in social learning, well, all what you will learn is outdated information. But asocial learning or innovation, on the other hand, that leads to the introduction of novel cultural variants, but possesses potential intrinsic uncertainty about the adaptiveness of those novel variants. So we all know the innovation process is not, doesn't work all the time. You can come up with this absolute amazing solution, but you can also come up with, less amazing situations. So, and what those models figured out is that efficient adaptation to especially changed environmental condition is, given by the finely tuned balance between these two processes of social learning and innovation. So, and this is basically one of these classical results in the social learning literature. The usefulness of social learning decreases when our environments become more and more unstable. So if your environment is frequently changing, pretty much it doesn't pay to look what everyone around is doing, because it's very likely that they actually just simply express outdated information. Good. But this models also provided us with some interesting insights into learning strategies that are expected in human population, especially in spatial and temporal changing environment, importantly at equilibrium. Because all of these models are, of course, equilibrium models. So what we have gained from this kind of mathematical modeling exercises are important insights into what human populations are expected to do if the cultural system is at equilibrium. But it is often very hard to verify this theoretical prediction empirically, because fine-grained data detailing who's learning from whom and why is only rarely available. So we really need this, incredible efforts by those empirical researchers to actually have this data. And if we have the data, we kind of don't need the modeling anymore. So in some sense, what we still don't know is how humans learn socially based on the available empirical data. And that's what we're going to start, with this talk. We're trying to build a bridge between the very rich theoretical work in cultural evolution and the equally rich empirical work in this field. So, and of course, you might ask immediately, okay, what is available empirical data? So, and I personally, or my research focuses often on anthropological and even archaeological case studies. So in this situation, often the only data source what we're having are population level frequencies detailing the usage or occurrence of different variants of cultural trait at one or different points in time. So that's the data we are having. And now from this data, we want to infer underlying processes. And what this phrasing does, it actually, turns our inference question into a classical inverse problem. So in spirit, this is a very similar problem that Robert described in his talk yesterday. So what we can, or what we know, or what we can observe are the population level frequency of different variants of cultural trait. So the different colored dots are just the different variants of my cultural trait. I might have them at one or different points in time. But what I'm interested in are what are the underlying processes of social learning that actually produce these frequency patterns. So, and of course, this question only makes sense if, in fact, processes of social learning are one of the main causes of frequency change. So that's something that, of course, has to be established a priori before any or for any application. And well, it's an inverse problem. And if you think a little bit of archaeological, case studies, if you have the archaeological record, in some sense, the archaeological record is the only evidence about past cultural traditions that we have. So if you want to make any inferences about underlying processes, we have to do this on this kind of data. So that puts quite some importance on this kind of inverse problem. But I want to be very clear. Whether this inverse problem is actually well posed, whether it can be solved, is completely unclear at the beginning. So just think of the problem of equifinality. So equifinality being the phenomena that different underlying processes produce exactly the same population level outcome. So that can very easily happen, that the data you're having is not of good enough resolution. So basically it does not carry any signature about those underlying problems because equifinality is just too high. So, and it's important that, in some sense we develop a framework that tells us when this is the case, because we need to know when this is the case, because in this situation we have to say, given the data we are having, we will not be able to infer those underlying processes because the data just simply doesn't contain a signature about them. So, and that's what we try to do. So we want to have a framework that allows for the inclusion of potentially complex demographic and cultural properties, but also for the simultaneous testing of a number of alternative social learning processes to account precisely for this problem of equifinality. And, one of those frameworks that could do the job is a so-called generative inference framework. This has been developed in population genetics, and they had quite some success with particularly reconstructing human history with those kind of framework from, let's say, from the data they are having. So how does it work? Well, it consists of two components: the generative model and a statistical comparison. So the generative model should be designed as a non-equilibrium, ideally, framework, capturing the main cultural and demographic dynamics of the cultural system considered. But importantly, it has to be a model which is comparable to my data. So the model has to produce output which we can compare to the data we are actually having. So in our case, our model has to generate frequencies of the different cultural variants present in the population under a specific social learning hypothesis. Okay, so in some sense, what we want to do with this generative model, we want to establish a causal relationship between learning processes on the one hand and observable frequency pattern on the other hand. So, and then we want to, of course, with the help of statistical comparison, that can be done with, let's say, ABC techniques or machine learning techniques or whatever you want to use. We then want to have conclusions about which maybe mixture of learning processes are consistent with the observable frequency data, and maybe more importantly, which are not. So that's the rough idea of it. Let me just try to be a tiny little bit more specific for the general philosophy of this framework. Let's assume that we have data at two time points, T1 and T2. What we assume is that, okay, if we take the data at T1 as our initial condition, and then we have to generate our generative model. And this generative model has to transform my data at time T1 into artificial data at time point T2, but this artificial data has been generated under a very specific and importantly known process of social learning. So for our modeling, it means it has been generated under a specific parameter constellation. So, and then we have artificial data of the same structure as my observed data. And now we can ask, okay, is this data close or is it not close? So, and then if it's close, then we can like, hey, fantastic. We have found a parameterization of my model that actually can generate artificial data very close to my observed data. And then I keep this parameter set. I do this many, many times because it's a stochastic system. And what I then have as an output are posterior distributions. So it's posterior distributions, let's say, over model space, which tell me which, or process space maybe, which social learning processes could actually generate my observed data. So that's cool because what we can do is we can exclude more. And that, I think, it's the power of this framework. We can exclude a lot of them as not being consistent with my data. And then in some sense, the width of those posterior distribution also give me some idea of the level of equifinality. If we have very wide distributions, well, then a lot of processes can generate the very same data. If we have very narrow one, that's the situation we are, happy about, because then the data has good signature about underlying processes. Okay, that's the general idea. However, in order for that to work, we have to be a lot of work in putting together the generative model, because it's inference based on a model. If you get the model wrong, of course, the inference is going to be wrong. So the advantages of this kind of null model-free inference is the straightforward inclusion of demographic and cultural complexity. So in some sense, we can try to replicate the system we are seeing. But those precise inference results can only be achieved if the model is indeed a meaningful reflection of the cultural system. So in some sense, what this does, it pushes us very much in the direction to move away from simply adopting models of biological evolution towards developing a bespoke theory of cultural evolution that is applicable to the cultural data. So in some sense, this just really pushes us to think hard, to not just take the biological model, but that we have to ask, what do we need to include in the model that it actually describes the cultural system? And most models of cultural evolution have been adopted from biological evolution, and they assume no age structure, no social structure, no learning of packages of traits. So traits are usually assumed to be transmitted independently of each other. They assume an equilibrium assumption. They assume that individuals possess no memory. And the list can go on and on and on. So, and now what we want to do with members of my group is just to go step by step and ask, have those assumptions or violations of those assumptions actually an impact on the dynamic of cultural change? So do they need to be included in the models, or can we safely leave them out? So, and I'm going to show you two examples. One is a demographic example. Do we need to include age structure? And the other one is a more cultural example. Do we need to include memory? Okay, let's start with age structure. That's research done in collaboration with my colleague Laurel Fogarty from MPI and with Volker Karstrup. He works in the digital humanities from the Mertens Institute in Amsterdam. So what's the strategy? Well, what we want to do, or what we want to understand is, do age-structured and non-age structured population produce the same kind of dynamic of cultural change? And in order to do this, we just use a standard model of cultural evolution under unbiased social learning. We'll explain in a second what this is, and analyze whether modifications of the underlying demographic assumptions, namely age structure or no age structure, will change the dynamic of cultural change. So unbiased social learning is just simply basically random copying. So cultural variants are chosen according to their relative frequency in the population. They're considered neutral with respect to the success of the individual. So why do we look at unbiased social learning? Well, definitely not because we think it's one of the most important social learning hypotheses, but the field of population genetics has provided us with this wonderful mathematical theory of neutral evolution. And unbiased transmission is nothing else than neutral evolution. That means we actually have a lot of theoretical expectation to which we can compare our results for our age-structured populations. And that's just a fantastic starting point to see, like, well, are there changes or are there no changes? Okay, often unbiased social learning in this literature is kind of modeled with a so-called Wright-Fisher model. So people in my project group know this now very well, luckily or not. So the idea is we have a population at time point t1, and to generate the population at time point t2, or at the next time step, we just start with a clean slate. So it's a non-overlapping generations model. And so this big bubble is going to turn orange with a probability of roughly 3/11. It's going to turn blue with roughly 6/11, and it's going to turn red with roughly 2/11. And with a very small probability mu, we introduce a completely new trait into the system. So easily done. So that could, for instance, be the population at the next time step. And now we continue this process, and then we can, just simply analyze or have expectation of the dynamic under this basically process of unbiased social learning. Okay, now the question we formulated again. Can we detect unbiased social learning by using expectation generated by a Wright-Fisher model that I just showed you if the cultural system generating the observed data possesses an age structure? So our next task is to do like, okay, we need a model of age-structured unbiased transmission. And that's just a sketch of such a model. Would we simply assume that in each time step our individuals age and they can die with a specific, death probability, which just generates as this kind of nicely pyramid-shaped age structures. So in order to keep population size constant, we just assume that at each time step, on average, n times p death individual enter this population. Those individuals are very naive, and then they adopt the cultural trait from a role model, which is randomly chosen from a specific copy pool. So and for this copy pool, we assume two extremes. First, we assume that, okay, we can copy from the whole population. And in the second case, we assume that we can only copy from the last time step, so from individuals of age 1, and see whether that makes a difference. Same analysis strategy, that's our model. We run it to equilibrium, and then we just simply take a sample from this model. And then we have the sample and ask like, okay, now let's use standard models which have been used to detect, let's say, unbiased transmission derived from the Wright-Fisher process and see whether we can basically detect unbiased transmission. So that's precisely what we do. So we have our sample C0 taken from an age-structured population. So, and the statistical test, it's called the so-called Owen-Watterson test, just to give you an idea how it works. Because we have this fantastic, mathematical theory, we know that under the Wright-Fisher model, a sample of size n containing k variance follows so-called Owen sampling distribution. That's just an absolutely wonderful result. It's one of my favorites. So we know, given any sample, we know the probability that it could have been produced via unbiased transmission or via Wright-Fisher process. So now what we do is we just simply at the bottom of this equation, we just simply sum up the probabilities of samples taken from Owen sampling distribution that have a probability smaller than our observed sample. So we calculate this tail probability, and if this tail probability is large, well, we have nothing to say against unbiased transmission. If it's small, we reject it. That's the structure, kind of simple hypothesis test. And now I analyze the strategy, run model to equilibrium, take a sample, calculate tail probability. We either reject or we accept. And then we record the number of time steps. The hypothesis of unbiased social learning has been rejected. Cool. So look at the results. First scenario, we can copy from the whole population. Nothing happens. What you see here is precisely this rejection probability. It's roughly 5%. Our assumed basically rejection probability. So, and the different colored lines are supposed to show different p-death values, so different, differently steep age pyramids. And we see all lines are just nicely overlapping. So, in some sense, if we can copy from the whole population, age structure has no influence on the dynamic of cultural change. Cool. Now, what happens when we only copy from the previous generation? Looks very different. So now we see that especially for extreme age structures, we would reject the hypothesis, especially when we have large samples with a very high probability. So, and this is now tricky on how to interpret this, because this test is not wrong. It doesn't tell us anything wrong. Of course it has, it's not wrong, but it's just basically we need to interpret it properly, because what the test tells us is if there are deviations from the Wright-Fisher process. And the answer is yes, there are deviations, because we can only copy from the last time step. But that we can't interpret this as, oh, it's not unbiased transmission. So that's why this is very tricky to interpret, because it is not the underlying transmission process which causes a rejection. It's basically the reduction of the copy pool. So, and that's basically a problem for interpretation, because we don't know what's causing those rejections. Maybe just a word like why this pattern occurs. Well, it is in some sense an accumulation process, because what happens now is that only individuals of age 1 actually contribute to cultural change when they can be copied. But everyone older than age 1, it doesn't die immediately. They're still around. So they are still, they still contribute to the cultural composition of the population, but not to cultural change anymore. And this accumulation effect is strong enough to kind of drive this pattern. So just to sum this up, the existence of an age structure does not per se have a consequence for the dynamic of cultural change. So if you know that actually copying happens from the whole population, you don't need to include this in the model. But if the learning process acts on the age structure by restricting the pool of potential role models, the population level signature can be changed. So in here, we really need to be careful how we interpret the thing. So analyzing cultural data with statistics or expectations blind to important demographic features of the population can lead to erroneous inference results. For instance, if rejections of the Watterson tests are interpreted as evidence for biased social learning, it is usually done in the literature. So this is really important to know, or to just remember. There's a lot of assumptions going in the test or going in your model. And if one of them is violated, it can, lead to the rejection of the test. And it doesn't matter whether it's the quantity that you're interested in or something else. It will lead to changes in, the population level signatures. So, and in the paper, you can look at that. We, of course, try to generate or try to develop a generative inference approach based on our age-structured model in combination with some machine learning techniques. And so inferences are possible if you have the right or an appropriate underlying model. However, we also show very clearly there are limits to inference because we have just very sparse data. We have only a single data point. So you cannot expect basically to infer everything from this small data point. We will have limits to inference. Okay, so demography has to or has not to be included in the model. Let's see what happens with the memory. So as I said, models are taken from biology, and there the cultural variant is similar to an allele, and each individual only has, of course, one allele of a gene. So, and that's the same thing has been carried over to the models of cultural change. So if individuals learn a new cultural variant, they immediately forget the one previously held. So, and I don't need to tell you that human cognitive capacities, of course, allow for memory processes, meaning the recall of past experiences. In our case, they can allow for the remembering of cultural variants and the adaptation level in those past experience environments. So in some sense, what we have, we can have a distinction between expressed and unexpressed cultural traits. So it's one that I'll be using and one that we just simply have in our memory or cultural repertoire. So, and now we ask, well, can actually such a memory process, I mean, it's incredibly simplifying, and if there's any memory researcher, he will probably be very offended by it, but I think it is sufficient for what we needed here. Can memory, meaning the accumulation of these experiences, affect the cultural advantage of social learning in changing environmental conditions? So does this classical relationship still hold if we allow individuals to have memory? So that's a project which is led by Madeleine Amar, who's a PhD student in our group. Okay, it's a model, so we have to go through some parts of the model that you see where basically the results come from. It's not been super complicated, but we will have to do it. So first we assume that we have two distinct states. So it's a very simple environment. You can either be in state 1 and 2 or 2, and in each time step, the environment can change with a certain probability. So this probability tells us basically how stable or unstable my environment is. Then we have a couple of cultural traits. So, and we assume that each variant is only adapted to a single environmental state. The thing about it's hot or cold, and either something works in the hot and not in the cold, or the other way around. And it possesses an adaptation value, which is just a number between 0 and 1, 1 being optimally adapted, 0 being not adapted at all. So, and then we assume that our individuals, they possess a cultural repertoire, which is comprised of the knowledge about a number of cultural variants and the adaptation level they provided in the past environments the individual has experienced. So, and also our individuals, they are characterized by their propensity to engage in social learning and by their propensity to forget. I will just explain in a second what the forgetting means. And this is important. So these two propensities, they are genetically inherited. So it's that's what's going to evolve. And that's what we're going to ask. Basically, how is social learning going to evolve in the system, and how is the probability of forgetting to evolve in the system? Cultural dynamics. So, of course, each individual needs to express a cultural variant at every time step. So, but now you not have only one variant, you actually have a repertoire. So the first step individuals do, they evaluate their cultural repertoire. So they do this by just simply, picking a variant from their cultural repertoire, and this picking happens proportional to the adaptation level or the level of benefit those variants have in the memory. So, and of course, this is a pretty error-prone choice rule. And, looking at the reinforcement learning literature, we also explored, different choice rules like softmax and so on. And who's interested, we can talk a little bit what would change if we replace this relatively error-prone choice rule. But for the time being, let it be slightly error-prone. So then we have chosen our variant, and then we have to make a decision. Is this a good one? Do we want to express it, or do we want to engage in learning? So, and the better or the higher the benefit of my variant, of course, the higher the probability that we just simply express this variant. So the lower the benefit, we just simply say like, oh no, this is not good enough. Now we engage in learning. So, and with a probability, and when we engage in learning, then we either engage in social learning with a probability Xi. Remember, this was our genetically inherited propensity. And or with 1 minus C, we engage in innovation. Social learning is just simply payoff biased learning. So you look around what everyone else is expressing, and then you just choose the variant proportional to the level of benefit. So highly likely that you end up with the variance which has the highest, or which has a high level of benefit among the ones that are expressed. And innovation is just, again, a simple random process. I know this is incredibly black boxing and probably infuriating for some of you. However, for this modeling and simplicity assumption, innovation is just simply a random invention process that we pick the adaptation level of the new variant to be introduced as uniformly from the interval 0 and 1. Okay, now we have our variant either obtained through social learning or innovation. So we express this variant and put it in our cultural repertoire. We are almost done, promise, because we don't only allow our individuals to add things, we also allow them to forget things, because we want them to be able to shape their cultural repertoire. So each individual forgets the cultural variants contained in its repertoire with a certain probability. And that's basically the second genetically inherited probability. So variants to be forgotten are chosen inversely proportional to the number of the times they have been expressed. We keep track of how often we use a variant, and then we forget the ones that are simply only very rarely used. Okay, last point, it's an evolutionary model, so we need some, death and reproduction. So demographic dynamics is simply done by a Moran model. So one individual is chosen for death and one for reproduction. Death is just simply random, and reproduction, of course, we want to have some selection in here, occurs proportional to the adaptation level of the expressed variant in the last time step. Now, the individual which is chosen for reproduction just simply passes on its two genetically inherited properties, the propensity for social learning and the propensity for forgetting, with a slight mutation. And also, the individual passes on its repertoire. And that's important because this is the only way in which we can pass on unexpressed cultural variation from one generation to the next one. That only can happen via vertical transmission. So that's absolutely crucial for the model. So we pass on the repertoire, but it doesn't pass on however the parents has used the variant. So that's something the offspring had to figure out by themselves. Okay, that's the model. Slightly more complex, but I hope still roughly clear what's going to happen. Now, the same thing, we initialize our problem model, we run it, and what we are interested in is to what values our variables C, the propensity for social learning, and phi, the propensity for forgetting, are actually what they actually evolve to on the population level. So that are the results. So it's a bit much, but we go through it slowly one by one. So first we look at the black line. So in the black line, it's basically the classical results. So we assume we have no memory, so you only can ever have one variant at a time. So what we see very clearly, so this is the average social learning propensity in the population. If the environment gets more unstable, if you see the values of PDES, the social learning propensity just simply goes down. And we also see that with this, with this happening, our population level black line on the right figure, the population level, adaptation level also goes down. Let's see a little bit what's happening. This is just a trajectory from a single from a single simulation. Look again at the black line. The stars are kind of environmental change, and you see whenever an environmental change is happening, our adaptation level is just dropping almost down to the bottom. Then, because we make innovation super easy, we have a recovery process, which is led by, the introduction of new now adaptive variants, and so we have a recovery, and especially in stable period, we actually reach a relatively high adaptation level. So now imagine if you have more environmental change, we have more frequent drops, but also we can't reach those high levels because, when we are halfway through, the environment is changing again. So, and that's why we kind of have this situation that adaptation level just goes down. So now let's look at the blue line. That's a situation where we allow individuals to accumulate, but we don't allow them to forget. Basically, now we assume like, okay, you remember everything. So, and that's what's happening. The social learning propensity is completely useless, because what we had to do is, for also computational efficiency, we had to set a cutoff. If they reached 500 variants, they just simply didn't learn anymore. It's just like they had enough, the memory is full. And if you don't learn, well, then it doesn't matter whether you want to engage in social learning or individual learning, because it's not used anymore. So what happens there is that our propensity actually evolves via random drift, so we don't need to look at it. But much more interesting is if you look at the adaptation level. They are low, but completely independent of the environmental instability. And if you look again at our little trajectory, what you see is that, well, we pay a price for this large repertoire. The price comes because we have a very erroneous or error-prone choice rule when choosing from the repertoire. But because we have collected so many cultural variants, we will have variants which are adapted to both environmental states. So in some sense, we don't need anything anymore. When the environment is changing, well, we just choose from our repertoire the appropriate one. So we have a lower average adaptation level, but also we are completely shielded against any environmental change, because they just don't cause any drops in the adaptation level anymore. Okay, and now the last one, what happens when I can shape my memory? So now look at the red line, and that completely reverses the classical relationship, because now social learning is increasing our mental instability. So why is this? Why is this happening? Let's look first at this trajectory. Again, in some sense, we have the best of both worlds. We have relatively high adaptation level and stable periods, but if we have a drop, it just doesn't go that deep. That's why our adaptation level is actually, stays pretty high. But what happens here? Well, first, okay, try it again. Yes, we look at this graph. This gives me the average variant number per individual, so the average number of variants we have in the cultural repertoire. Look at the dashed line here. This is roughly the border. So right of this dashed line, you are likely to experience at least one environmental change in your lifetime. If you do this, you see all of a sudden a huge increase in number of variants contained in your repertoire. But before that, so when those environmental changes occur only very occasionally, the cultural repertoires actually stay very small. So What's happening here? Well, it's an interesting, let's look at that first. It's, in some sense, how the cultural variants or how the cultural repertoires are shaped. So what do you see on this slide is how we try to represent the difference for the situation where you can forget and where you cannot forget. So this is the highest environmental instability what we have. This is the situation where you basically accumulate variance without forgetting, and that's a situation when we allow forgetting to evolve. And what you see very clearly is that in this situation, our repertoire is structured. We still, each individual has, so sorry, that's also the population, so it's not an individual repertoire, it's basically the variance of the whole population. But what you see is that each individual is likely to have cultural variants which are adapted to both environmental states. But the big difference is that the forgetting allows those variants to be shaped. So, and that means that the variants that are actually individuals are expressing, they are likely to be good. And that also means that if you have to engage in social learning, then even in this situation, you actually copy something useful. Okay, so first we have seen we have high number of cultural variants in those really unstable variants, meaning we are individually already adapted to have traits adapted to both of those environments. But if the stability is, or it gets more and more stable, our repertoires are changing. They're getting smaller and smaller. But again, in the situation that the bulk of the variants, of course, the one with the high benefit, you only have a couple of ones that are purely benefit that are basically poorly adapted. And now look at here at this situation. Now we have much less variants adapted to the alternative environment. And that's okay, because in some sense, we don't need everyone to have a variant adapted to this alternative environment. It actually needs only one individual, because our propensity for social learning is high. That means in the environment has changed. If we have 2 or 3 guys which have a variant adapted to the other individual, other environment, they just express it, and other ones can copy from it. So in that sense, we have removed the problem of social learning and an environmental change, because we have made a situation that this social information doesn't need to be outdated, because we had something good in our cultural repertoire. So and that's kind of this interesting or very finely tuned interplay between the cultural repertoire, how you choose from your cultural repertoire, and your propensity for social learning. Okay, here also something what I said before, if blue is again the situation where we don't have any forgetting process, and you just do a lot of suboptimal choices. So when you choose from your repertoire, you get it often wrong. You often don't get the optimal variant, meaning the one with the highest adaptation level. And this probability is very, very, very smaller in our situation where we can shape the memory. Shape the repertoire. And also we see if we have a suboptimal choice in the first situation, well, we make actually quite a substantial error. In the second situation where we can shape our repertoire, this error is almost neglectable. So we have, we have an error-prone choice rule, but the structure of our repertoire makes it actually irrelevant that my choice rule is actually quite error-prone. That's kind of cool. So the inclusion of memory, meaning the individual collection of cultural variants expressed in the past, can change the relationship between social learning and environmental uncertainty. So it means we have to go away from this allele cultural variant analogon, because it has the potential to change the most classical result of the social learning virtues. Cultural variation can be unexpressed, can be maintained unexpressed, meaning without impacting the current and current adaptation level, which in concert with high propensity for social learning lead to efficient adaptation to previously experienced environmental conditions. So one caveat, of course, this only works in reoccurring environments, because per definition, memory is only helpful if you have seen it before. Okay, so last thing, we talked a lot about the model. So the model needs to reflect reality. But the data, of course, is also important. So if the data is not of good enough quality, also our inferential problem we won't solve it satisfactorily. So and you might say like, well, of course, if the data is sparse, all sorts of problems occur. And I want to just very quickly demonstrate to you, it's not about necessarily the sparsity of the data. So even if I have a huge amount of data, I can have huge problems with inferential power if the data has not the right quality. So if you have a lot of data for those, mathematical modeling exercises, is then often a question, how do we reflect this? There's this large amount of data, or how do we summarize it? And here we use an incredibly crude, but nevertheless very interesting summary statistics, the so-called progeny distribution. And that records the abundances of cultural variants which produce k new individuals, offspring, over a fixed period of time. So progeny distribution looks like that. So it's often shown on a log plot. And here we have the number of variants which produce precisely one instance in my interval. That's the one that produced 10, 100, and so on. So it's abundance distribution. How many variants occurred precisely once, 2 times, 3 times, 4 times? Okay, that might be a little bit of an odd choice. However, there's a reason for that, why we're kind of looking at that. We want to look at specific data source, baby name statistics. It's probably one of the best cultural data sets we are having. So almost every country is recording the name of the newborns. So, and there's a lot of work done already on those data. And also Alex Bentley pioneered in some work using the statistics to infer, in some sense, underlying social learning processes. And what he hypothesis was very interesting, because he said like empirical progeny distributions, empirical baby name progeny distributions, they look consistent with unbiased social learning. So that's curious. And I also caveat, this doesn't mean that they hypothesize that unbiased social learning is basically how you choose the name of your baby. I mean, every parent knows that this is a very elaborate process. What it means is that there's probably no population level tendency to prefer one category of names over another. And also that is interesting. Basically, there's nothing really in the population which would deviate it from unbiased transmission, something I would not have expected. Like, okay, let's put this to a proper test. And that's work I've done with James O'Twire, who's a theoretical ecologist at now the University of Illinois. So, and by now you know how the drill goes. Before we can do anything, we need theoretical expectation. We need the neutral progeny distribution. So what we would expect under unbiased transmission. And as Wright Fisher models are notoriously difficult to generate expectation, we used kind of a neutral birth death process, which is often used in ecology. So we are not interested in the details, but we ended up with a distribution in the large time limit, which gives us the probability that a variant has produced k offspring within a long period of time, precisely what we wanted. And this distribution had this interesting structure. Of course, there's a power law, exponent 3/2, but interesting, there's an exponential tail off. And this exponential tail off is actually modulated by the innovation rate. The higher the innovation rate, the earlier the onset of this tail off. So, and that's, this distribution is cool also for another point, in the sense that it contains the ratio of these two model parameters, the death rate and the birth rate. So we have one equation and one basically unknown, this ratio. And for that, we could simply write down a maximum likelihood estimate. And so we have a theory we can very, very easily fit to our data. So, and that's what we have done. Okay, just as a side note, why I think this is an interesting statistic, the shape of the neutral progeny distribution is only very weakly influenced by age structure of the population and by temporal changes in population size. And that's cool because, you know, those demographic properties are usually unknown. And if my distribution or my expectation is not changed by it, that's great because I don't need to worry about it. Okay, so now we applied this to a data set from Southern Australia. Left the result for girls, right for boys. The black line is the empirical result, and the gray line is the maximum likelihood neutral progeny distribution. So what you see very clearly is that empirical data and our theoretical expectation don't match very well. importantly, or we see, is that our expectation, we're not able to generate the large number of singletons. So we would not believe 40% of the names in this database occurred only once. So there's a huge number of kids in this data set. This is consistent over, almost all countries that have a unique name. I never thought that it's that high. But anyway, our theoretical expectation is not able to do that, but it's also not able to generate the relatively high abundance of very frequent names. And what you see on the red line is that we found that in some sense an anti-novelty bias was actually able to reproduce our data almost perfectly. So we don't say it's anti-novelty bias, it's just like there's we have a consistency between this social learning bias with the data, meaning that parents actually, or that we have a population level tendency which goes against rare names. So that's interesting because, you would say like, okay, all the fashion trend ideas, like, oh yeah, if something is rare and then it comes into fashion, we have these boom and bust cycles. But here it is more like the case, we have so many singletons and so many of those names are just very crappy that they cannot be transmitted. So in some sense, a name needs to be transmitted like 2, 3, 4, 5 times to show its worth. And when it has shown its worth, so in some sense, this initial advantage decays, and then in some sense, it is more like kind of in a neutral fashion. So that's basically what we found, where we found this evidence for anti-novelty bias. So there's just so much there that sometimes shouldn't be there. So, and now the data problem. You might wonder, why did we use something from South Australia? There's much better data sets, let's say in the US or anywhere else. That's the only data set where we can find that was complete, meaning we had the frequencies of names with just a frequency of 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Most data sets, they're restricted, or they are basically cut due to privacy considerations. So, and 2 common ways of cutting this data is just either removing all names containing less than 5 instances considered time interval. It's called a total threshold. So you remove all names which have, in let's say, a 40-year period, not reached a frequency of 5. Or you remove all names containing less than 5 instances in each year. So whatever it's done depends a little bit what the Statistic Bureau has decided to do. But these were the 2 main ways of kind of, making the data incomplete. So, and now we say like, well, does it make a difference to our inferential analysis? And the result is it does. So on the left side is our complete data set. The middle line is when we applied the total threshold. So we just removed everything which has a frequency less than 5. And now you see that actually theory and data, they match pretty well. So if we had just taken the US data, where we have basically this pre-processed data, but we don't have those rare variants, you would have said like, oh yeah, unbiased transmission actually fits perfectly. But if you look at a situation where the statistic bureaus use a year-by-year threshold, then it's even worse. Look at that. The discrepancy between the 2 lines is even worse. And now it's not even an anti-novelty bias. Now we would actually find evidence for novelty bias. So in some sense, the way you threshold the data might have a huge impact on how, or on the inferential outcome. So in the middle bit, it's just like, well, we created an equifinal situation because now unbiased transmission and anti-novelty are able to generate the pattern we are seeing. So even if you have a lot of data, omitting key parts of the data set, such as all low frequency variants, can lead to misleading inference results. So just having, I'm running over, I promise I wrap up in a second. So this is an important role for rare variants for inferential purposes. Okay, that's an important lesson. Just having a lot might not mean much if we miss the important part of the data set. So just my last slide, just to summarize, I hope what I could tell you is, I told you a lot of problems, but also what I hope I can convey is that we are an incredibly exciting point, because it feels like that we have now the tools to actually turning some, of the theoretical cultural evolution work into an inferential science. So we have tools like generative inference framework, and that's by far not the only ones, where we can actually use our theory to apply it to data, But that forces us, in some sense, to develop better models, to develop models which are just not biological models, that are models that actually reflect our the cultural reality a little bit better. So now, I just want to make it very clear, I'm not criticizing all the work that has been done. That was very important to get us to this point. But now we are at this point where we can move further, where we can actually have a discussion with you, people working more on the cognitive science question, ask like, which of the boxes which are still in the models are worth unpacking, and how do we unpack them? What do we do with it? How do we make this model kind of more realistic? And that's just, I feel like a super exciting point where we are to kind of developing this bespoke cultural theory. And I hope, that this discussion has just helped doing that. And the last point, because this is so dear to my heart, I just want to also say that even if you get the perfect generative model, it doesn't mean that we can solve the inferential problem, because it also still depends on the data. There will be still times where you're like, oh, the model is perfect, but still we have an equifinal situation. And that's not a problem of my model, nor the data. It's a property of the data. We just need to know when this happens, that we then just say like, yeah, this is a research question. We cannot answer with this kind of data. Okay, sorry for running over. Thanks for listening. And if you have any problems, I'm very happy to discuss any of that.